My name is Eric Wright. I'm the Education Specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and joining us for our book talk today. Before we get started, I just want to say a special thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support and all the free programming that we get to do virtually. Not only our book talks, but our drink and draw events, trivia nights, our movie discussion nights. So all that is brought to you by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation, and of course support for the foundation coming in the memory of Pat Finley. So thank you to the Finley family as well, and both of those, the organization and the family, for their continued support and all of our free virtual programming that we get to do here at the museum. I just want to remind everybody today that we do have our security features enabled. So if you have any questions for our author at any point during the program, please send any questions directly to me via the chat function. As usual, I'll be putting all those questions into a PowerPoint, bringing up the PowerPoint at the end when we do our question and answer session, so everybody can see the questions. And speaking of questions for our author today is Sara DeLuca. Sara is the author of 2 books of regional history published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, as well as 3 poetry books. Editing a book on the Civil War letters is what she was here to talk to us about today, was a new undertaking, one that absorbed her time and attention for nearly 3 years. Today, she's going to talk about her journey writing this book, not only from acquiring the letters, but also the editing and the publication process. And she's also going to share excerpts from Lute Moseley's unusual, articulate, and candid reports to his family in Beloit. The title of the book is Heavy Marching: The Civil War Letters of Lute Moseley of the 22nd Wisconsin. Sara, welcome to our program today.
Oh, thank you so much, Eric. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. I really feel privileged to have been able to edit this book, Heavy Marching: Civil War Letters of Lute Moseley, 22nd Wisconsin. This was a heavy march for me because I have done a lot of writing of memoir, regional history, poetry, but I have never edited a book before. And it was a real adventure, which absorbed a lot of my time during the pandemic when I was home with many extra hours on my hands. And what a gift to have these letters and be able to work on them and end up with publication by the University of Wisconsin Press. I just want to read a couple of endorsements on the back of the book, which pleased me very much. George C. Rabel, a noted Civil War historian, wrote, "I have read hundreds of such collections in print and manuscript. So for a collection to attract as much of my interest as this one did speaks to its quality. Virtually every letter has something of significance to students of the war, a rarity." And another endorsement that summarizes the book pretty well. Moseley's letters offer evocative descriptions of a Union soldier's life with unsettling immediacy. We endure muddy marches, tolerate incompetent officers, witness the savagery of battle, mourn the deaths of friends, forage with the bummers, and yearn for peace and home. Lute Moseley tells us what it really felt like. And that's from Fred Burwell, who's the Beloit College archivist emeritus. He was very helpful in some of the research that I did here. Actually, Beloit College was the very same institution that young Lute Moseley studied in. He was in the prep academy there and ready to start college when he decided to enlist in the war. Everyone asks me, how did you acquire these letters? I'm a native Wisconsinite, but I have lived, I think 24 years of my adult life in the southeastern United States in various locations. And during the time I was living south of Atlanta, I met a lovely woman named Esther Moseley. She was 87 when I met her. She was working on a collection of letters written by her husband's grandfather. She wanted to prepare them for publication, and I offered to help her. But Essie, as we called her, died about a year after I met her, and so we didn't get a lot of work done. I moved back to Wisconsin a short time later, took copies of the letters with me and thought I might continue, but life got busy and I put them aside for quite some time. Then came the pandemic, lots of time to work on this. And so it kept me happily occupied for quite some time. I love first person history, that telling, that personal telling of, and it becomes history written as it was being lived. So from that, we get a real intimate, personal interpretation of what's going on. And it also gives voice to the common person, which so often doesn't happen because so much of our history is written by people who, you know, scholars and people who are maybe higher in the social ranks. In this case, Lute Moseley was an infantry soldier, very articulate, probably better educated than the average infantry soldier, but his letters are so forthright and honest, and he's just composting his days, sharing his daily experience with his mother and father in Beloit and his younger brother, and then reflecting on how he feels about those experiences. And we have the whole range from some sentimental, you know, he's missing his home and family terribly, as most young soldiers did, of course, on both sides of the war. But there is the whole range of human emotions in here. So my working title with these letters originally was Ever Dear Home, with the same subtitle. I thought that was a charming way to begin a letter and a lovely title, but the editors at the Wisconsin Press thought it was a bit too sentimental for such a range of emotions besides sentiment. And I think heavy marching fits quite well because there was so much heavy marching in this regiment. The chaplain, George S. Bradley, summarized the distances marched by this regiment during their service, 3 years from 1862 to 1865. And here's how it adds up. By railroad, 2,700 miles. By steamboat, 1,400 miles. On foot, 2,400 miles. Total, 6,500 miles traveled. And so much of that time on foot was really heavy marching through mud and swamps and impossible, almost impossible circumstances. And yet they endured. Lute actually did survive his service and lived to be almost 80 years old. He was born exactly 100 years before me. And strangely enough, this book is now coming out exactly 100 years after his death, which I think is sort of serendipitous or something. I think I should just begin by sharing some of his writings, and then we'll comment on them. Well, first of all, I want to say, why would a young farm boy who has, well, it was not an easy life for sure, but, you know, comfortable enough, and to enlist at that time when he was hoping to start a college career, well, there was tremendous social pressure to serve your state, your community, your country, of course, and make your family proud, maybe see a bit of the world. I mean, a farm boy had not been very far from home, yearning for some adventure, yearning to prove himself a man. He says that in many letters. I try to be a man and act my part. And then there was a financial consideration. They were paid $13 a month in the infantry. In the beginning, it was raised a little bit toward the end of the war. And that doesn't sound like much, even considering in today's, with today's inflation, which would be like 25 times that much, would still only be at about $325 a month if we consider today's values. And of that, he sent $10 home, kept $3. It was a help to the family, a considerable help. So that was probably also an incentive. Sometimes he had to ask for some of that money back because he would be really needing some things that the Army didn't provide. But for the most part, those allotments went forward. Lute Moseley's regiment became part of Coburn's brigade, fighting in the Western Army. The brigade consisted of the 85th Indiana, the 33rd Indiana, 19th Michigan, and 22nd Wisconsin. And those 4 regiments stayed together in that brigade throughout the war, which was a little bit unusual. Okay, just an excerpt here. They left from Racine, Wisconsin. And on October 14, 1862, he's writing to his young brother, Eddie. Eddie is 8 years younger than Lute. He said, we're camped 40 miles from Cincinnati in Kentucky. We have not lost a man out of our regiment yet. We were 3 days on our way here. The first day we marched 8 miles, the second 15, the third day 17 miles, making 40 miles to the state line, and tomorrow we will march 16 miles. There are lots of boys who gave out on the way, but old Lute is good for it. 17 miles might not seem to you a long way to march, but with 40 pounds of cartridges and your knapsack on your back, your haversack filled with crackers, your canteen filled with warm water, and a heavy musket you are obliged to carry in position all the time, and dust flying so thick you can't see, well, it's a little different from taking your own natural gait. It is hard. And then he goes on to say that he is, he has the blues a little bit, but he doesn't want them to be worrying about him. He said, we do have to guard rebel property. We are now camped on rebel ground. This man has 2 sons in the rebel army. We're not allowed to touch even a rail in his fence for firewood, even when we are nearly frozen to death. We are not allowed to touch even an apple in the orchard along the road. We have to stand guard all night to keep others from touching aforesaid property. Good heavens, I ask, when will this rebellion be crushed out? I did not expect when I enlisted to fight against my own people. Kentucky, of course, was one of those border states, bitterly divided between Union sympathizers and Confederate sympathizers. And even though slavery was allowed in Kentucky and the other border states, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and later West Virginia when it split off from Virginia. They were just divided. I mean, it was a terrible situation, neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. And so he's reflecting that experience. He didn't expect to see that in Kentucky, I guess. It wasn't long before illness began claiming a lot of these young soldiers. The sanitation was terribly inadequate. Drinking water was polluted. Diets were not well balanced. Sudden troop movements made it very hard to get any kind of adequate hygiene established. So they were dying. He said on December 28, 1862, there have been 30 out of the regiment that have died already. 5 died in one night. There are a great many sick. When we left Racine, we had 96 men. Now there are not only over 50 that are fit for duty. My health is still pretty good. Thursday, we had just finished burying our dead boys when we had orders to march for Mumfordsville, 55 miles from here. So in the morning, we pulled up and started. And then he describes another really difficult march through mud and rain and sleeping in a tent that has so much water running through it that he said you could drink anywhere off the floor. Footnote here. By the time that Wisconsin's 22nd left Nicholasville on December 12th, they had buried 9 soldiers and had to leave many behind in the hospital. Germ theory was poorly understood at the time. And of course, that contributed to a lot of this illness. Malaria, cholera, typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia were probably the main illnesses that took lives. Of course, they were plagued by rats and lice and all kinds of other things that made life pretty miserable. Some of his comments are almost amusing. A proud Wisconsin farm boy, he doesn't see much to admire in these southern states. He writes from Danville, Kentucky on January 15, 1863. The country in this part of the states is, to a northern boy at least, anything but inviting, nothing but hills and rocks, until he thinks it is not the country but the Union we are fighting for. He feels like complaining and wonders why so much blood is shed over so poor a country. Let's see. I'll skip forward a bit. Many of the soldiers in Lute's regiment, in fact, in his whole brigade, were engaged in a terrible battle at Thompson Station in Tennessee, and they were captured and put in prison, Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia. Fortunately, for only about a month because of a prisoner exchange that occurred. But even for a month in such terrible conditions, many of them sickened and died, and some of them just suffered terrible emotional damage from that as well. So there's a period of time here where we don't have letters because he couldn't write from prison, and he did give some account of that later. My friend Esther Moseley had started narrating this, and she wrote this. Libby Prison was an old brick warehouse on Tobacco Row, located on the waterfront of the James River in Richmond. The enlisted men were housed in a room 40 feet wide and 100 feet long. The prison had barred windows, of which many were broken, causing it to be drafty and cold. It offered little chance of escape. It was densely crowded, teeming with vermin. The floors were filthy. This is where the men slept, jammed so tightly together that there was just enough space to lie down. Each prisoner ferociously guarded his territory. Sick bay had no doctor, only a former undertaker who would try to aid and comfort the ill. The Confederate Army had taken all available doctors for their own wounded, so there were few supplies such as medicines or bandages. Sick soldiers were on their own. after being liberated from the prison, Lute and many of his comrades were sent to College Green Barracks in Annapolis, where they recovered some. And then from there, they were sent to a parole camp in Tennessee. Oh, I'm sorry, St. Louis. And there they had to remain in non-combat roles for quite some time until an official prisoner exchange could be accomplished. So they were very bored and restless during that time, and some of them drifted home on what was called French leave, unofficial leave, but not really punished because they didn't have any real assignments. And Lute did make it home for a week or so during that time as well. But the prison experience, I think, just made them feel more fierce about fighting this war. He wrote, I am poor as a snake, but I have gained a little since I got back to America. I feel like fighting them as long as I live. We all got as lousy as we could be, and our hips are all worn out from lying and sitting on the floor so much. Well, that struck me a bit. He's so glad to be back in America. And, you know, we have to remember these were two separate countries. I used to hear the term war between the states a lot, and I used it once in one of my footnotes, and I was brought up short on that. This was not a war between states. This was a war between two separate governments, two countries. So I had to change that for sure. I've heard other terms for the war. And during my many years in the Southeast, I visited many battlefields and museums. And I remember one very proper docent in a museum in Macon, Georgia, who said, we call it the great unpleasantness. Well, that is probably one of the biggest understatements I've ever heard in my life. The Northerners often called it the War of Southern Rebellion. And of course, the Confederates called it the War of Northern Aggression. The chapter on the news from Tennessee, well, they weren't engaged in battles there much. It was more picket duty and guarding. They weren't to engage in any combat roles for a while, so it got a little tiresome. And Lute did take the opportunity to write a lot about camp life, and there's some charming descriptions of that. But I think I'll have to skip forward here. Let's see. In the beginning, he didn't appear to have a strong motivation politically, or, you know, he wasn't a staunch abolitionist. I think his understanding of conditions for the enslaved was, you know, pretty marginal. He probably didn't know a lot about that or have great feelings about it, but that grew as time went on, and that's expressed in his letters. On November 29, 1863, he writes, I was on guard down at the depot a few nights ago, and there was a train came in from the front loaded with Negro women and children. I never knew what want was. If they weren't a pitiful looking lot of humans, I never want to see any that are. I had a loaf of bread and some coffee, and I gave it to them. You ought to have seen their big eyes stick out. They came from Alabama, and they say there isn't 1/4 enough to eat there. Some of them were real smart. He has other passages in later letters where he expresses great sympathy. In one, he once more and more Black people began joining the armies, both North and South, but he's talking about the northern ones here. He feels so sorry that so many of them cannot read and write, and how they must suffer not being able to communicate with their families. Letters were just a lifeline to the soldiers, staying connected with their homes and sharing their experiences. It's amazing that so much mail did get through. Some got lost, and some of the packages that were sent from home would be possibly stolen or just lost in transit, because there was so much disruption of railroads and transportation. And then with the troops moving, suddenly it wasn't always possible to get the mail through, but it's amazing how much did get through. Here he writes a funny little note about that. June 7, 1864. He's now in the North Georgia mountains. He says, I'm going to drink my coffee now and seal this up, but I want to tell you how Charlie had a letter directed to him. Over the hills with love and joy, this letter goes to a soldier boy. Overcome every obstacle, go in a hurry until you reach Charles P. Murray, 22nd Wisconsin, Company B, in the city of Nashville, Tennessee. That's all there was on it, and it got there. Usually he would make a note at the end of a letter, and if he knew they were moving on somewhere, and tell them where to direct the next letter. And that seemed to work pretty well. This regiment fought in the Battle of Atlanta and at whole Atlanta campaign, and then on Sherman's March to the Sea, and that is stunning reporting that he does. The death toll and the horrific wounds are just astounding. You know, historians now say that 750,000 died in the Civil War. That's revised up from what was previously thought. And that is a higher toll than this country has had in all its wars up through the Korean War. A lot of the reason for that, I read, is that the weaponry had so outpaced the tactics. They were still lining people up and marching them forward, so they would just be mowed down. Apparently, General Sherman was getting a little wise to this and using some different tactics. Here, Lute writes on June 24, 1864, General Sherman is acting very wisely, I think, for he flanks them out and lets them do the charging instead of fighting them as at Stones River and Missionary Ridge. Right on the ground where I am sitting day before yesterday was held by Rebs. Here's where they charged so on our lines. I would give $50 if you could have gone over this place when we advanced yesterday and seen all the dead Rebs, lots of them. How far do you suppose a shell shot from a 12-pounder will go into a green oak tree? Guess before I tell you. I have seen trees that I think are more than 2 feet through, with a 5-inch hole clear through them. How much further it went, I don't know. Now, how far do you think that big Lincoln gun would throw a ball into wood? Some Rebs have their heads taken slick off. The woods are all cut up with cannon shot and musketry. One Reb had 5 musket holes through his breast. You bet he stopped right there. I guess that tonight the Rebs will get out of this if they can, but I don't know or care. For the longer they stay here, the worse it will be for them to stop again. General Johnston is not in command of the rebel forces here now. I don't know who is. Some say Longstreet. It don't make any difference, for we are bound to whip them. It's amazing. Oh, and he says about the presidential election, I think old Abe will be elected, and I certainly hope he will. He will have my vote. If they let the soldiers vote, he will be elected, sure. The only hope the rebels have is that we will elect some other man in his place. I think they will give in if we put Abe in again. I certainly hope that you all at home will do your utmost for his support. You will, won't you, Father? Of course, he's addressing his father. This is 60 years before women got the vote in this country. For such a tender-hearted young man as he appears to be in many of these letters, the fierceness of this and the jubilation over killing Rebs is just hard to reconcile with some of the other sentiments. For example, at one point, Lute is out foraging and having to make himself a bed on the ground, and he steals some hay from an emaciated mule and feels just terribly guilty and sad about having to do that. I've often thought about what a strange thing it is that we can compartmentalize our emotions in that way. I suppose it's for survival. Well, I'll have to rush along here, and there's so much good material, especially during the Atlanta campaign. He describes the destruction of Atlanta. Yesterday, I went down through the city. It has been a pretty place, but there's not a nice dwelling house left there. Destruction of property has been large. In the north half of the city, every house is torn by Yankee shells. Everyone in the city has what we call bummer's holes, which consists of a hole dug deep enough in the ground and covered over with dirt from 3 to 9 feet where they live. How do you think you would like such a dwelling place? There is a lot more about Atlanta and tearing up the railroads. You've probably heard of the Sherman neckties, where they heated the rails and twisted them around trees and disrupted the transportation. And then the foraging. Of course, the army had to be fed, so they would be going through the countryside, taking whatever food and supplies they needed, sometimes going way beyond what they needed, just to bring the population to its knees and make them want to give up. Going through the Carolinas was the same. South Carolina in particular, because they were the first to secede and they felt they had started the war there, so they were punished in every way. It was really interesting to annotate this material, because not being a Civil War historian, I was learning as I went. I knew what I didn't know, but I wasn't always aware of what other people didn't know. So, for example, when Lute talks about we had to corduroy the road, well, I knew right away as a farm girl what that was. We used to make these corduroy roads out of timber and logs, whatever we could get to make a soggy ground solid so we could get farm machinery across it. My editor said, okay, a lot of your readers are not going to know that, so you need a footnote there. So that's just an example, kind of a challenge, and I did get some wonderful help from the University of Wisconsin Press. I think I'll just do about 5 more minutes here, and then we'll see if we have some questions or comments to share. April 16, 1865. Things are looking much brighter. The Union forces can see that victory is in sight. And he writes to his parents and brother, "The future looks brighter, and surely I have strong hopes of being allowed the great enjoyment of once more returning to your kind and loved society, which I must confess I have at times nearly despaired of. Yes, there have been many times when I thought it looked very critical. Sure, I thought some would get home again, but it's almost a miracle how so many of us could be spared through so much danger and hardship. It was officially announced to us this morning that President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at the theater in Washington. I don't believe it yet. There is a report this afternoon that it is not so. I hope it will prove untrue, surely." Well, of course it was true, but there was such a dearth of information reaching the soldiers and so many rumors, they had learned not to trust the news very much. Finally, after the Appomattox courthouse meeting and the surrender, the armies marched toward Washington, D.C. for the Grand Review. And on May 25, 1865, Lute is writing about that. They're camped near Washington. "My pencil is inadequate to describe our feelings at this time. We volunteered to help put down the rebellion, which we have done. We did not volunteer to remain in the service as required to parade and make big shows to gratify the ambition of officers and to be reviewed and re-reviewed and kept in the field when no human being can see the least bit use for it. It is hard to the once free boys of Wisconsin, at least. We have been marched from Raleigh to Richmond almost on a double quick. This we all stood like men, supposing it was to hasten our discharge, but come to find out it was only a race between the different corps commanders. We had some hope of being transported from there, but no, we marched to Washington, then a grand military display, a grand review. What benefit does the nation receive from it? The public are invited to attend, so we who have faced bullets are brought out and paraded around like a pair of fine horses for a show. Who are the spectators? Let me tell you, principally the young dandies of the northern cities who have managed some way to keep out of the army." He is very unhappy about that, and of course they're all exhausted, but finally they are mustered out. The last letter from Lute to his family in Beloit was on June 5, 1865. He was mustered out at Fort Lincoln and traveled by train to his home in Beloit. Lute Moseley lived to be almost 80. Farmed, raised a family. There's a obituary, his obituary at the end of the book. And just the final paragraph here. In his inaugural address of January 3, 1866, the one-armed Lucius C. Fairchild, Wisconsin's governor, spoke of the peaceful transformation. As a former Union general and diplomat wounded in the battle at Gettysburg, his words carried great significance to all who had sacrificed. 1 million of men have returned from the war, have been disbanded in our midst, and resumed their former occupations. The transition from the citizen to the soldier was not half so rapid or half so wonderful as had been the transition from the soldier to the citizen. And he reported on the heavy financial burden carried by the citizens of the state and the heavier cost in lives that could not be recovered. A total of 10,752 Wisconsin soldiers, about 1 in every 8, had died while in the service of their country. Well, I think it's time to see if we have any questions or comments.
You know, Sarah, that's enough of his life. And I really would like.
Can't hear.
It was just so much good information. Like you said, it was so intimate. I really want to read it. Just perfect. We have many questions. Close up real quick. Pardon?
I'm having a little trouble with the audio, Eric. Okay.
Sarah, our first question actually came a little late. I'm going to go straight to it. Came through the chat here. One of our audience members asked, what would you say was Moseley's life view changes from the beginning of his listening to his discharge? Seen any significant changes in the man himself?
Okay. I think I heard most of that, Eric.
Okay.
Were you saying the changes that come through in the letters as to his maturing and changing as a result of the war experience?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, I think it comes through quite clearly that this young man who was only 19 when he enlisted and was 22 when he was mustered out had really grown in compassion all around. And it seems to me that he, while he had to compartmentalize and demonize the enemy, which is what we do in war, I guess, always. Otherwise, how would they do it? He seemed to understand that these young men he was fighting were not so different from himself. Also, anytime he had interactions with the Black soldiers or citizens, that compassion and growing understanding came through. And also, I would say his appreciation of home. He always expressed love for his family, but that deep appreciation for what he had at home and his longing to return to it, that just grew and grew. And he said if he could be home again and have that peaceful farm life, he would never be discontented with it. And I think that is actually what happened. He had a very successful farming career and was active in the GAR. He didn't talk about the war much, his family said, except when he was together with people who had experienced the same thing. I think there's an alienation that happens when people have such traumatic experience. It's really difficult to share that with others.
Yeah, it really is. Creating those bonds in a post-war environment, it is very difficult. We've seen that time and time again throughout, many battles, many wars. Most recently, our soldiers coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan. There was a lot of trouble, fitting back in sometimes to the regular world. I'm going to go to the slideshow here real quick. Can you see the question now?
I'm sorry?
Can you see the question up on the screen?
No, I don't.
Maybe I'm not doing it right. Just a moment. Here we go. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, how long had Esther Moseley known about this collection of letters? Okay. The Moseley family had passed these letters down through the generations. So they had, had them for quite some time. And I think they shared them around in the different family households. Unfortunately, the original letters were mostly lost. We think in the 1950s, according to the type of typewriter they were transcribed on, had done that really difficult work of putting these, taking the letters and transcribing them on a manual typewriter so they could be more easily read and shared. And they were shared around the family quite widely. And somehow the originals were lost. I don't know if someone discarded them thinking, well, they're so difficult to read, we want something that can be shared more easily, and they didn't value that original, which is really a shame. So often soldiers wrote, the paper was hard to come by. They would write very tiny to conserve the space, and they'd write in the margins, and their utensils might have been not good, faded pencil, that sort of thing. So we don't know. And she wasn't even sure who had done the original typewritten transcription. So my transcribing was taking that typewritten work and putting, digitizing it. And I think whoever did the first transcription was very careful about it, maintained all of his misspellings and funny little wordings, so I stayed faithful to that.
So just so we're clear, did you get to see any of the original letters at all?
No, I didn't.
No? Okay.
No, I wish I could. I went to Madison for some of my research and held original letters in my hands in the archives there. And it was just wonderful to have that material and, the first original work. And I wanted that so badly, but no one could locate it. And in fact, in the letters, he writes about diaries and journals and scrapbooks that he had put together, and those were also lost. Mm-hmm. So we're just glad that we had what we had to work with.
The next question, Sarah, let me pull this back up here real quick. And of course, you just spoke to this, what has become of the letter collection? Mm-hmm. Were some of those transcribed letters, have they been donated to any sort of institution or archive?
Well, we had wished that we could find them that way, and I contacted every museum and library that I thought could have ended up with them, and we never recovered them.
Okay, that's unfortunate.
It is. Yeah, it sure is. But we're just glad we have his words. There's absolutely no doubt about authenticity of it. It's just that people now understand the value of these original documents better than they did at the time, I think.
Yeah. Understanding and knowledge has certainly improved over the years.
Mm-hmm.
What was the most difficult part of editing this book, do you think?
Oh, I think, well, not being an experienced researcher, I think it was just kind of getting a handle on what needed, further background and explanation to make this a book that would be, open it up to readers who weren't necessarily Civil War scholars. And I did get some good help with that from the University of Wisconsin Press, kind of helping me understand where those annotations needed to be. It got easier as I went along. So
Isn't that always the case?
I think so, practice.
One thing that I noticed as you were going through it, and I'm sure there's a lot of information that just wasn't covered simply because of time here. But did Lute receive any injuries during his time with the 22nd Wisconsin? It seems like he kind of went through the war relatively unscathed.
Pretty much unscathed. There was one time he got a bad bruise, a very close call, but really nothing more than a bruise. So yes, he was extremely fortunate, and he was sick a few times, but never near death. So
yeah, especially going through colleges.
Right, and that isn't true of all his comrades, of course. These were locally organized companies, and so a lot of these boys knew each other intimately from school and their own neighborhoods, and he really mourned the loss of some very dear friends.
Yeah, that comes through in the work, especially when you're talking about being in the prison camps, and then having to go to St. Louis for the sort of the work release program that they had set up. But just we know through all many more lives were lost by disease and wounds than actual cost of the battlefield. And like you mentioned as well, just our knowledge of germ theory was so inadequate during this
time. Oh, I see a comment from a Moseley family member there. Thank you very much.
Let me read that comment real quick. I'll bring that up. Right here in the chat, it says, we are in awe of your emotional account of Lute's remarkable experiences in the Civil War and beyond. Your devotion and impeccable research for this wonderful book, something we can proudly hand down to our family and all kinds of other families throughout the U.S. too. I would just throw in there. We really enjoyed your presentation today, and this is from actual members of the Moseley family. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
Let's see, we got a couple more questions here, Sarah. Did you find any information about why his brother did not serve? You mentioned his brother earlier, and one of our audience members was curious why you have one brother who did serve and one who did. Was it age?
Oh, he was younger, quite a bit younger. In fact, at one point, Lute wrote, I am so grateful that neither my brother nor my father have to serve. If they had to go through what I had gone through, I would do 3 more years myself to spare them. The brother at the end of the war was only 16 or 17, so just under the age where they were drafting men at that time. And he might have had to serve if he'd been a year or 2 older, but he did miss out on that. And the father was just a little too old to serve, because by the time they had instituted the draft, I think it went up to the age of 50 or something. I forget exactly, but the father was 53, so he did not have to go in. But there were fathers and sons serving together in Lute's company.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have many accounts of that. Flocks of brothers. This is well before the experiences that we got in World War II, with families being lost all in one attack. Fortunately, the military has broken family members up, sent them off to places.
Yeah,
but that was not the case in the Civil War at all.
Yes. one passage I meant to read, but I'll just mention it a couple of times. He writes about the fraternization that happened between the Johnny Rebs and the Yanks right across the river from each other. They would go in swimming together. They would trade tobacco and coffee and jokes, you know, and agree we aren't going to fire if you don't. And then they would actually have friendly conversations and probably get to understand that, well, these are just boys like me. And then the next day they'd have to shoot each other. I mean, it's just hard to get your head around.
Yeah, war is not an easy thing to understand, and especially when you're in the midst of it and you don't know why, or you're just not certain why you're there. You know why you're there, but everything becomes a little muddied and a little unclear.
Yeah.
Especially when you have instances like that.
Right.
I think this is our last question here. Oh, no, that was the last question, but we did have one more come through in the chat. Of course, where can we find this fantastic book?
Oh, yes. Well, University of Wisconsin Press has a good website where you can order. And just now, within a few days, it will be out with other sources like Amazon or Barnes and Noble, lots of places where you can get it. But the official publication date is June 27th. So I don't think they're sending out orders till that date, but University of Wisconsin Press is sending them out now. So.
Okay. And when I noticed that you held it up, that was a hardback cover?
Yes, it is. Yeah, I was really quite pleased with the design. I didn't want something that was, well, it looks fierce. It's a fierce book. Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. And I'd like to thank our audience members for joining us for this fantastic presentation. I hope you do get a chance to pick that book up. I know I'll definitely be looking forward under the 27th of this month. Sara, again, thank you so much for your time today. We greatly appreciate it. And for everybody else out there, just keep in mind, if you are interested in any of our other events, you can always find listings of those on museum.com/events. Like I said earlier, we don't have just book talks. We also have our trivia events, which we have trivia tomorrow night if you're signing up for that. Movie discussion nights, drink and call events, curator conversations. We do a whole lot of virtual programming, and of course, it's all free. Thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation and the family of Pat Finley for all their support. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your Monday. Sara, once again, thank you so much. And if there's anything the museum can ever do for you, please just let us know. We'd be more than happy.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, everybody.
Bye all.